because you had been through a time where maybe in your own mind you didn't know if you were going to live, right? To be gone for so long. Do you think it's possible that she could still have gotten through it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. She could absolutely still be alive. I mean, there are cases that span many more years than mine does, and they came back alive. I mean, and we're talking years and years. Yeah. So she absolutely could still be alive. There, I mean, of course, there is the alternative, but until we know, yeah, we have to keep looking until she deserves, either way, to be brought home.
Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 100 days. 100 days since the morning of January 31st, 2026. 100 days since someone walked through her front door in the Catalina foothills, north of Tucson, Arizona, and took an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and a daily medication schedule out of the home she had lived in for years. No suspect arrested. No confirmed sighting. No recovered remains. Nothing. And yet this week, 3 things happened that the mainstream coverage has either buried, misread, or failed to connect to each other in a way that actually makes sense. That is what this video is. Not a recap. The story beneath the story. The forensic detail the headlines skipped past. The statement made by a woman who survived 9 months of captivity that stopped investigators and advocates dead in their tracks. And the single strand of hair sitting inside a laboratory that helped crack the most significant serial killer case in American history. A lab that may now be reading the identity of Nancy Guthrie's abductor from the molecular architecture of evidence left behind on the morning she vanished. If you are new here, this is Crime Unresolved TV. We cover the Nancy Guthrie case deeper than anywhere else on YouTube. Every new development, every expert analysis, every piece of evidence that Brian, N10, and News Nation uncover, we break it all down for you here. Subscribe and hit the bell right now, because the moment the next development breaks, you are going to want to be here. Now let us get into it. Here is what you already know. You know Nancy is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, anchor of NBC's Today Show. You know there was blood on the front porch. You know about the surveillance footage showing a masked individual. You know about the ransom demand. That is the surface. What you have not heard, what most people are not connecting, is what Elizabeth Smart said on May 5th that stopped a room full of investigators and victim advocates in their tracks. What you have not heard is what the laboratory that identified Rex Heuermann, the Gilgo Beach serial killer, is now potentially doing with a single strand of hair pulled from inside Nancy's home. And what you have not heard is the chilling detail buried inside a Fox News report about someone in Arizona who searched for Nancy Guthrie's home address not once, but twice. The second time just 20 days before she vanished. Let us start with Elizabeth Smart, because what she said on May 5th, 2026, in her CNN interview with Aaron Burnett was not a feel-good soundbite. It was a statement loaded with forensic and experiential weight that most coverage completely missed. Smart was asked a direct question. Given that Nancy is 84 years old, given the pacemaker, given the absent medication, given that more than 3 months have passed, is there any realistic chance Nancy Guthrie is still alive? Smart did not hesitate. Absolutely, she said. Absolutely, she could still be alive. Most people heard that and filed it under optimism. That is the wrong read, because Smart did not stop there. She went further. She said there are cases that span many more years than mine and they came back alive. Years and years. She was not reaching for comfort. She was citing documented reality. She was drawing on the only category of knowledge that gives her statement its actual weight, the lived, embodied experience of being taken from safety, held captive, and brought back. That is not a theory, that is testimony. Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped on June 5, 2002, 14 years old, taken from her bedroom in Salt Lake City in the middle of the night, held for 9 months by Brian David Mitchell, chained, moved across state lines, forced to disguise herself in public while her family searched for her. People walked past her on the street and did not know who she was, and she came home. That history is not background color in her CNN statement. It is the entire foundation of why her words carry the authority they do. When Smart invokes J.C. Dugard, kidnapped at 11, held for 18 years, recovered alive, or Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, held in Ariel Castro's Cleveland House of Horrors for over a decade before walking free, she is not listing inspirational stories. She is building an evidentiary argument. She is saying that what looks from the outside like an impossible survival window has, in documented and verified cases, been survived. She is saying that the reflex to assume the worst, while understandable, is not supported by the full picture of what long-term captivity cases actually produce. And then she said something else that most coverage buried in paragraph 6 or 7. She said, "Either way, she deserves to be brought home." That phrase, "either way," is doing significant work. Smart is not naive. She is not telling us everything is fine. She is acknowledging the darkest possibility while simultaneously refusing to let it close the door. When a woman who was chained in captivity for 9 months and still came home tells you not to close the door on a missing 84-year-old, you do not close the door. Now here is where Smart's framing becomes clinically important, because the specific nature of Nancy Guthrie's abduction, the planning, the method, the deliberate execution, carries forensic implications that bear directly on whether Nancy is likely being held somewhere or whether something worse has occurred. And to understand that, you have to go back to a date that most people scrolled past entirely. January 11th, 2026, 20 days before Nancy disappeared. Inside a Fox News report, buried well below the headline, sat a piece of data that should have stopped every reader cold. Google Trends data confirmed that someone located in Arizona searched for Nancy Guthrie's home address in the Catalina foothills on 2 separate occasions. The first search occurred between June 21st and June 28th of 2025, 6 months before the abduction. The second search occurred on January 11th, 2026, 3 weeks before Nancy vanished from inside that address. Let that sit for a moment. Someone in the same state where Nancy Lives ran targeted searches for her specific residential address not once, in a moment of idle curiosity, but twice, separated by 6 months, with the second search landing 20 days before she was taken from her home while she slept. That is not coincidence. That is not a Savannah Guthrie fan looking up her mother. That is surveillance. That is the digital record of someone studying a target, confirming a location, preparing an operation. Now here is where it deepens. When investigators put out a public request for surveillance footage from the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, they did not only ask for recordings from January 31st, the morning Nancy was taken. They specifically requested footage from January 11th as well. Not a nearby date, not a general window. January 11th exactly, and they narrowed the window further. They asked specifically for footage captured between 9 p.m. and midnight on that evening. Law enforcement does not generate specific time windows without cause. They had reason to believe that whoever searched for Nancy's address online on January 11th did not stop at the digital search. They believed that person got in a car, drove to the Catalina foothills, and physically confirmed what they had found on a screen. A Google search in June 2025. A second Google search on January 11th. A physical visit to the neighborhood that same night between 9 p.m. and midnight. And then, 20 days later, the abduction. That is not impulsive violence. That is a rehearsed operation. And that distinction is not minor because it determines everything about the logic of what happened next. Planned kidnappings, particularly those involving elderly targets from families with financial resources, follow a specific operational logic. When someone spends 6 months identifying an address, returns to confirm it digitally 3 weeks before acting, physically reconnoiters the property, and arrives on the morning of the abduction with a mask, a backpack, and knowledge of exactly where the front door camera is mounted, that person is not there to kill. That person is there to extract value. And value requires a living subject. Now let us talk about the ransom, because this is one of the most misunderstood chapters of this case. Shortly after Nancy's disappearance, multiple outlets reported that ransom demands had been received demanding $6 million in Bitcoin. $6 million. Untraceable, borderless, and irreversible once transferred. Not a rounding error. Not a casual ask. A specific, deliberate sum requested in the currency most designed to disappear. On February 4, 2026, Savannah Guthrie and her siblings Annie and Cameron posted a video on Instagram addressed not to the public, but directly to whoever had taken their mother. They said, "We received your message. This is very valuable to us and we will pay." Read that again. A family with resources and national media connections, certainly in contact with the FBI, went on camera and publicly stated they had received communication from their mother's captors and were willing to pay. That is not theater. That is a family that believed, on some operative level, that someone on the other side of that message had Nancy. A man named Derek Kella was subsequently arrested for sending a fraudulent ransom text to Savannah Guthrie. He is charged with that fraud specifically, and nothing else. He has no charged connection to the actual abduction. His trial is scheduled for June 23rd, and his existence, the existence of one confirmed fake demand, has polluted the public understanding of the ransom narrative in a way that serves no one looking for the truth. Because the existence of a fraudulent demand does not eliminate the possibility of a real one. In every high-profile kidnapping case on record, opportunists generate false demands within days of a disappearance going public. The FBI has documented this pattern across every major abduction investigation of this type. The question is never whether fake demands exist. The question is whether any of them are real, and that question remains publicly unanswered. Now let us talk about what investigators have confirmed about the physical evidence from the scene, because the details here are specific and they matter. The FBI described the suspect captured on Nancy's surveillance cameras as standing between 5 feet 9 and 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an average build, wearing a mask. He carried a black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. That brand is sold exclusively at Walmart. It is not a tactical pack. It is not ordered online with a card that generates a record. It is the kind of item you buy with cash in a store that sells thousands of identical units every week. That is not an accident of preference. That is a deliberate operational choice made by someone who understood traceability and eliminated it at the point of purchase. A black glove was recovered approximately 1.5 miles from Nancy's home, consistent with the gloves worn by the suspect on surveillance footage. No usable fingerprints from that glove have been publicly reported, and the suspect's approach to the front door camera, the precise way he neutralized it, indicates prior knowledge of its exact position. You do not walk up to an unfamiliar front door and instinctively know where to reach for a camera unless you have already studied that door. In person, from photographs, or both. That detail loops directly back to January 11th, back to the casing visit, back to the 9 p.m. to midnight window in the Catalina foothills. This suspect did not arrive on January 31st to discover the layout of the property. He arrived knowing it, because he had already been there. Now here is the layer of this investigation that has received the least coherent public attention. The relationship, or more accurately, the fracture, between the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI. Because these two agencies are not operating as one seamlessly coordinated unit, and the public record makes that impossible to ignore. Brian Tin of News Nation reported that a sergeant inside the Pima County operation allegedly described the investigation internally using a phrase that translates, without the profanity, to an absolute disorganized disaster. That is not an outsider's criticism. That is a description attributed to someone inside the operation itself, and it does not exist in a vacuum. Ben Williamson, the FBI's Assistant Director of Public Affairs, went on X and made a statement that is remarkably blunt for a sitting federal official. He wrote that the DNA hair evidence was not new, that the FBI had asked to test it 2 months ago with the same technology they had always had, and that when the local sheriff instead sent it to a private lab, the FBI was left waiting. Read between the lines of that statement. The FBI is publicly calling out a local sheriff's department for a 2-month delay in handing over what may be the most critical piece of physical evidence in a federal kidnapping investigation. And Sheriff Chris Nano's public response to direct press questions about whether a new person of interest had been detained. One word: nope. That is it. 100 days into an active federal kidnapping case, an 84-year-old woman still missing, the FBI and the local sheriff on separate pages publicly, and the sheriff says nope. This is not a well-coordinated investigation at the surface level. And that dysfunction has consequences, because it delayed the FBI's access to evidence by 2 months. 2 months that the forensic genealogy process could have already been running. The FBI has the hair now, and that changes things, because where that hair is going, or where the people closest to this investigation believe it is going, is the reason this case is not over. It is arguably the reason this case may be approaching its most significant turning point. The lab in question is Astria Forensics, based in San Francisco. And what they did to Rex Heuermann is the reason every serious investigator following the Nancy Guthrie case is paying attention to that hair sample with an intensity that borders on reverence. Heuermann was the Gilgo Beach killer, a Long Island architect who murdered at least 8 women between 1993 and 2010 and then walked back into ordinary life for over 30 years. He went to work. He had a family. He was invisible because he was careful, and he was careful in exactly the way that careful killers are. He left almost nothing behind. Almost. What he left was hair, not hair with a root follicle attached, rootless hair, a strand without an anchor. The kind of evidence that sat in storage for 30 years, because the science to read it did not yet exist. Astria Forensics built that science. They developed a method to extract mitochondrial DNA from rootless hair, genetic material that does not identify a person with the pinpoint precision of nuclear DNA, but that, when processed through forensic genealogy techniques, can construct a family tree. Not the suspect's name directly, something almost as powerful: their relatives, their cousins. The distant branches of a biological family that, when mapped carefully and cross-referenced with public records, can be traced back through generations until the tree narrows to a single person sitting at its root. That methodology sent Rex Heuermann to a courtroom. He pleaded guilty in April 2026 because the DNA architecture assembled against him was so comprehensive, so precisely constructed from that rootless hair, that his own defense team recognized there was no credible path forward. 30 years of careful evasion ended because of one strand of hair and a laboratory that refused to accept the old limits of what forensic science could do. CeCe Moore is one of the foremost forensic genealogists working in the United States today, operating out of Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. She has been involved in some of the most significant DNA-driven case resolutions in recent American investigative history. She went on record specifically regarding the Nancy Guthrie case and the hair sample now in federal possession. She said she is, in her own words, pretty confident the FBI will want to use Astria Forensics for this evidence. She did not hedge. She expressed directed confidence. And then she said something that deserves to be repeated slowly. She said the hair evidence collected from inside Nancy's home has the potential to be potentially critical. Not useful, not helpful, critical. That is the considered professional judgment of a woman who has spent her career calibrating exactly how significant forensic evidence actually is. She chose that word deliberately. Moore also disclosed that she has personally been involved in 6 cases in which Astria Forensics applied this exact methodology. 6 cases, 6 successes, every single one produced a result. Every strand of rootless hair that went into that process came out attached to a name. If the hair recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home yields usable mitochondrial DNA, and the experts closest to this evidence are indicating it may, then the person who walked through her front door on January 31st is not protected by the mask, the gloves, the Walmart backpack, or any of the careful precautions they took that morning. They are protected only by a window of time, and that window is closing. Here is something critical to understand about how forensic genealogy actually operates, because the mechanics explain why the FBI spent 2 months fighting the Pima County Sheriff's Department for access to this sample. This was not a procedural preference. It was urgency. When investigators run a DNA sample through this process, they are not submitting it to a criminal database and waiting for a direct hit. They are submitting it to genealogy databases that contain the voluntary genetic profiles of millions of ordinary people who tested themselves to trace their ancestry. The system searches for partial matches, biological signals that indicate a family relationship rather than a direct identity. A cousin, a second cousin, a grandparent's sibling's descendant, someone who shares enough genetic material to establish a branch of the same family tree. From those partial matches, analysts build outward. They construct generations of relatives using public records, birth certificates, obituaries, census data, marriage licenses, and every other thread of documented human life that leaves a paper trail. They work the tree in every direction until the branches narrow, until the candidates thin, until investigative work can close the remaining distance and land on a specific individual who matches not only the genetic profile but the geographic and behavioral profile already assembled. Then, without any contact, without any search warrant, without any signal to the target that they are under scrutiny, investigators collect a covert DNA sample, something the suspect discarded in public: a coffee cup, a water bottle left on a bench, a cigarette. They compare it to the profile. If it matches, the case is complete before the suspect has any idea a net was ever drawn around them. That is not a theory about how this might work. That is precisely how it worked in the Heuermann case, and in dozens of cases that have followed the same forensic path. The suspect never sees it coming because the entire investigation happens in silence, in databases, in family trees, in a laboratory in San Francisco. And then suddenly it doesn't. The FBI did not fight a 2-month procedural battle with a local sheriff's department over evidence it planned to shelve. That fight was about a timeline, and every day of that delay was a day the forensic genealogy process was not running. Now let us talk about the layer of this investigation that has received the least coherent public attention, and that is the question of who, within Nancy Guthrie's orbit, had the kind of access to her life that the planning behind this abduction required. The Google searches for her address were conducted by someone in Arizona, not a journalist in another state researching a story, not someone tangentially aware of Nancy Guthrie from Savannah's public profile, someone in the same geographic territory where Nancy lived, who knew to search for that specific address in that specific neighborhood. And when investigators asked the Catalina Foothills community for surveillance footage from January 11th, they were not casting a wide net. They had reason to believe a specific person was physically present in that neighborhood that night, and they wanted the visual record to confirm it. Experts consulted on kidnapping for ransom operations have been consistent on this point. The most precisely executed abductions of this type rely on intimate knowledge of the target, her daily schedule, the layout of her home, the exact location of her security equipment, the fact that she was frequently without other adults present inside the residence, the specifics of her medical dependency, the pacemaker, the daily medication, the particular vulnerability of her health profile. These are not details that surface in a Google search. These are details that belong to the interior of a person's private life. And that means whoever planned this operation either possessed a personal connection to Nancy Guthrie directly or had cultivated a relationship with someone who did. Investigators have reportedly administered polygraph examinations at the Pima County Sheriff's Department. That fact alone carries significant weight. Polygraphs in a kidnapping investigation of this scope are not deployed at random. They are deployed when the investigative circle has contracted inward, when law enforcement has reason to examine people with direct or indirect connections to the victim, rather than faceless external actors. The testing signals that this investigation is not exclusively looking outward at strangers. It is examining relationships. It is looking at who had access to Nancy's life, her routine, her home, her medical situation, her address. And then there is the search of Annie Guthrie's home. Annie is Nancy's daughter, Savannah's sister. She and her husband Tommaso Kai were living in proximity to Tucson, closer to Nancy's day-to-day life than Savannah, whose schedule and New York residence kept her at geographic distance. In the weeks following the abduction, investigators arrived at Annie's residence and conducted a search lasting several hours. No arrests followed. Investigators described it publicly as evidence collection and declined to elaborate on what they were looking for or what they found. The search of a family member's home in this context is not routine. It is not box checking. Investigators may have been looking for evidence of communication with whoever sent the ransom demands, trying to establish whether any channel of contact existed between the Guthrie family and Nancy's captors outside of what had been disclosed. They may have been examining financial records or correspondence that could illuminate connections within Nancy's personal circle. They may have been doing the kind of exhaustive, leave nothing unexamined work that a serious federal investigation demands when every lead matters and eliminating possibilities is as valuable as confirming them. But investigators do not allocate hours of manpower to searching a family member's residence unless they believe something inside that residence is relevant to their understanding of the crime. That is not how investigative resources work. None of this points a finger. Let that be absolutely clear. The presence of polygraphs, the search of Annie's home, the investigative attention directed at Nancy's immediate circle, none of it constitutes evidence of wrongdoing by anyone connected to the Guthrie family. What it constitutes is a thorough investigation that understands one fundamental truth about crimes built with this level of architecture. The information required to execute them almost always originates somewhere close to the target, and investigators have an obligation to follow that truth wherever it leads, however uncomfortable the direction. Now consider the reward structure sitting on top of all of this, and what the silence surrounding it actually communicates. The FBI placed a $100,000 reward on actionable information. The Guthrie family placed up to $1 million on top of that. Combined, over $1 million sitting on the table for anyone with credible knowledge of Nancy's location or the identity of the people responsible. That reward has been publicly available for months. No successful claim has been reported. No arrest has followed a tip. No public announcement has indicated the reward triggered a breakthrough. There are two ways to read that silence. The first is a case that has genuinely stalled, where the evidence has run dry, and the investigation is maintaining the appearance of momentum it no longer possesses. The second is a case where investigators have developed leads they are deliberately protecting from public disclosure, because premature exposure would compromise an operation that is still actively closing. Former FBI agents who have commented on this investigation have leaned toward the second reading. Their reasoning is straightforward. The FBI does not commission the laboratory that identified a 30-year serial killer for a case it has quietly set aside. It does not spend 2 months in an institutional conflict with a local sheriff's department fighting for a hair sample it does not intend to use. The energy invested in obtaining that evidence tells you something about the value placed on it. Agencies do not fight for things they do not need. Law enforcement has also increased active patrols around the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, not because the case is winding toward closure, but because the volume of amateur investigators, content creators, and curious observers descending on the area has created a new operational problem. When a neighborhood adjacent to an active crime scene becomes a destination, it generates noise that can obscure genuine investigative signals. You do not allocate patrol resources to manage that problem unless the surrounding environment still has investigative value. Human remains were discovered in proximity to the area during the investigation. They were tested. They were confirmed to be prehistoric, not modern. A septic tank and a backyard manhole at the property were searched. The immediate landscape around Nancy's home was examined with the thoroughness a federal missing persons investigation demands. Nothing connected to Nancy Guthrie was found. The absence of remains is not proof of life, and that has to be acknowledged honestly. The desert terrain in the Catalina foothills is vast, and the capacity for concealment within it is real. But the absence of remains exists alongside something else. It exists alongside the complete architecture of a ransom-motivated abduction, and those two realities, read together, say something meaningful. If the primary objective of this operation had been Nancy's death, the planning investment would not have been necessary. You do not spend 6 months identifying an address. You do not conduct physical reconnaissance of a neighborhood 3 weeks before acting. You do not arrive with a deliberately selected untraceable backpack and a working knowledge of camera placement. You do not send $6 million cryptocurrency ransom demands. You do not generate leverage and then immediately eliminate the source of it. The logic of this crime, to whatever extent logic governs decisions like these, is the logic of extraction, not elimination, of holding, not ending, of a person whose continued existence was, at least at the outset, the entire operational point. Savannah Guthrie came back to the Today Show after 2 months away. She stepped back behind the anchor desk because life requires us to keep moving even when a piece of our heart is somewhere we cannot reach. But Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The case is still active. The FBI is still working it. The DNA evidence is being analyzed. The reward is still waiting to be claimed. And a laboratory in San Francisco that has never failed, 6 cases, 6 successes, may already be building the family tree of the person who walked through Nancy's front door on the morning of January 31st. Elizabeth Smart said something in that CNN interview that deserves to close this video. She said, "Until we know, we have to keep looking. Not until we assume. Not until the calendar makes the outcome feel inevitable. Until we know." That standard, drawn from the personal testimony of a woman who was held captive for 9 months and came home, is the only honest standard available in a case where certainty has not arrived in either direction. Nancy Guthrie went asleep in her own home in Tucson on the night of January 30th, 2026. She was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker and a medication schedule and a neighborhood she had known for years and children who loved her. She did not choose what happened next. She did not get a warning. She did not get a chance to prepare. What she gets now, what we owe her now, is exactly what Elizabeth Smart said. Not assumption, not resignation, continued looking. Continued pressure, continued refusal to let her name recede into the archive of cases the world moved on from before the answer arrived. The FBI has the hair. Astria Forensics has the methodology. The reward is waiting. And somewhere in a laboratory in San Francisco, a single strand of biological material may already be speaking in a language that leads directly to a door that has not yet been knocked on. If you are still here, you already understand why this case matters. Subscribe to Crime Unresolved TV and leave a like on this video. Every subscriber, every share, every person who stays in this conversation keeps the pressure exactly where it needs to be. We are not going anywhere, and neither is this case.